Not surprisingly, Revelations, chapter 13, verse 16, quote, "All people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, were forced to have a mark. Without the mark of the beast, it was impossible to buy or sell anything." Now, some might take this Bible verse to be a prophetic warning about digital ID. As it so happens, digital ID is about to be rolled out around the world, and it's more evil than anyone could have imagined, except perhaps the author of Revelations, that is. So today, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about digital ID and when it will be coming to your country. Not to be dramatic or anything, but this may be the most important video you'll ever watch. Let's start with a definition of digital ID so we're on the same page. A digital identity is a digital way of proving that you are you. In other words, digital ID is a digital version of the physical IDs that many of us have, be that a national ID card, a health card, driver's license, or passport. Like physical IDs, a digital ID is issued or accredited by the government and requires basic biometric information to create. Biometric information includes any physical attributes that are unique to you, such as your face, your fingerprint, or your iris, the coloured part of your eye. Unlike physical ID documents, a digital ID is stored on an electronic device such as your phone or computer. However, all the data about your digital ID is technically stored by the government or by whichever private company the government has contracted for this purpose. This is a small but significant detail because it means that digital ID systems are extremely centralized and ultimately outside of your control. The government or private company which issues the digital ID has the power to make changes to your digital ID without your consent, including deleting it. Although the government or company which issues your physical ID has access to the same personal information, making changes to your physical ID requires physically confiscating it from you. This is obviously much more difficult to do than changing a few of your settings in a digital ID system. However, the biggest difference between physical IDs and digital IDs is that there are multiple different types of physical IDs, each with their own issuing institution or authority. With a digital ID, your national ID card, your health card, your driver's license, your passport, and even your bank card are all rolled into one. While digital ID systems are only just starting to be rolled out, the research and development so far suggests that your digital ID will be connected to absolutely everything. It'll be linked to the assets you own, it'll be integrated into voting systems, and it could even be required to access the internet. Now, advocates of digital ID insist that these systems will make everything more efficient, more inclusive, and of course, much safer. However, it should be clear by now that digital ID systems have the power to become more evil than anything any religious text could have possibly predicted. Besides making changes to your actual digital ID, the government or private company would have the power to prevent you from purchasing goods or accessing services, including all of those I just mentioned. In short, a digital ID system would be one of total top-down control with no escape. And it's a system that every single country will be rolling out in the coming years. Now, if you're wondering where this supposedly universal push for digital ID is coming from, the answer appears to be the United Nations, or UN. Introducing digital ID is part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, that member states must meet by 2030, which is literally every country. If you watched our video about the individual carbon credit system the UN is planning, you'll know that the UN is working closely with the private sector, the public sector, and with other international organizations to ensure that all 17 SDGs are met in every country by 2030. The international organisation that's been the most involved with the UN's SDG initiative is the one and only World Economic Forum, or WEF. For those unfamiliar, the WEF consists of over 4,000 of the world's most powerful individuals and has almost every major institution on its members list as well. The WEF signed a strategic partnership with the UN in mid-2019 to, quote, jointly accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To that end, the WEF has been pushing the SDGs through ESG with the help of BlackRock, Bank of America, and others. More about the ESG investment ideology using the link in the description. Now, it's important to note that the WEF is not the only organisation that's been involved in the rollout of digital ID. What's fascinating is the organisations pushing digital ID seem to fall into two categories. The first represents private sector interests, and the second represents public sector interests. Logically, the private sector and the public sector both have a lot to gain by rolling out digital ID systems. For the private sector, the primary benefit is an increase in economic participation and profits therefrom. For the public sector, the primary benefit is an increase in surveillance and control. Naturally, the WEF represents private sector interests. Now, the other two organisations aggressively pushing digital ID are the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. The World Bank has been especially active in the development of digital ID. It's been testing digital ID systems in Africa and India for years. In a discussion about digital ID from December 2020, Mari Pangestu, the managing director of the World Bank, explicitly stated that the organization's digital ID development would not be possible without its partners, specifically the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Note, folks, that all sources for this are in the description if you don't believe me. Now, when it comes to public sector interests in digital ID, there seem to be three organisations that have been aggressively pushing for it. The first is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The second is the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS. And the third is the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. Those of you who followed the channel for any length of time will be familiar with all three. For the IMF and the BIS, the interest in digital ID comes from the fact that digital ID is required for governments to roll out their central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Both organisations have explicitly stated this in various reports and blog posts. For the FATF, the interest in digital ID seems to come from the desire of public institutions to standardise digital ID systems around the world. In March 2020, the FATF published a lengthy report suggesting digital ID standards. This is much more significant than you think. That's because the FATF has the power to coerce countries to comply with its so-called recommendations by issuing related regulations in their jurisdictions. Digital ID falls under FATF Recommendation 10, which is due diligence, aka background checks, on individuals and institutions. Given that the purpose of the FATF's recommendations is to essentially ensure the status quo of the current financial system, I expect that it will eventually require all countries to ensure that all crypto wallets and services are connected to digital IDs, at which point most cryptos will be no different from most CBDCs. A failure to comply will probably result in financial and social restrictions, or worse. By now, you're probably wondering when digital ID will be coming to your country. Well, it looks like almost every country will have a national digital ID by 2025. This is the timeline given by the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, in a report it published in February this year. The report is titled, quote, Digital Strategy 2022 to 2025, and I'll leave a link to it in the description because it is seriously insane. For starters, the report reveals that the UNDP's digital strategy was first announced in mid-2019, almost exactly when the WEF signed its partnership with the UN. The report also repeatedly states that the pandemic accelerated the development of digital ID around the world. It reveals that over 60 countries worked with the UNDP to deploy over 250 digital ID solutions. This is where things get seriously scary, so sit up straight and pay very close attention. In April 2019, consulting firm McKinsey & Company published an in-depth report about digital ID. The statistics in it are cited in many of the studies and blog posts published by organizations that represent both public and private interests in digital ID systems. You know, the organizations I mentioned earlier. So, what do you think the voluntary adoption of digital ID is in the countries where it's been tested or rolled out? According to McKinsey, fewer than 10% of people have adopted digital ID voluntarily. This is not surprising in the slightest, given the dystopian characteristics of digital ID systems. As a fun fact, the voluntary adoption of digital IDs is almost identical to the voluntary adoption of CBDCs in G20 countries, estimated by the BIS, specifically between 4 and 12%. This underscores the fact that the overwhelming majority will not voluntarily adopt the digital systems the UN wants to implement. The fact that the UN is apparently developing a separate digital ID system for the elites really says it all. So, how do you force the average person to adopt a digital ID when they don't want to? Well, there's only one answer, and that's to create a situation where the average person needs a digital ID to do everyday things, a situation where not having a digital ID makes living unbearably difficult. During the pandemic, dozens of countries demanded that their citizens show digital proof of a medical procedure that I shall not name because of the YouTube algorithm. The UNDP report arguably proves that these digital certificates of compliance were de facto digital IDs, in case that wasn't obvious enough. To be clear, I'm not saying the pandemic was at all premeditated. All I will say is that a pandemic simulation called Event 201 was conducted in October 2019 in partnership with the WEF, which partnered with the UN to push SDGs earlier that year, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has spent billions on digital ID development. There's also BlackRock's report from August 2019 that predicted the fiscal and monetary response to the pandemic and even what comes next for the economy after it's over. That will be in the description. Now, with that said, there's no question that the UN and its affiliates took advantage of the pandemic to run large-scale tests of their digital ID systems. I mean, the UNDP says this over and over in that digital strategy report. The UNDP report also reveals that digital ID will be used to support and enforce the UN's other initiatives, such as the Paris Agreement. If you watched our aforementioned video about individual carbon credit systems, you'll know that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement establishes these systems. The UNDP report even reveals details about how exactly the UN's digital ID push is being coordinated from the top. It discusses a, quote, digital governance group which is providing all the funding. What's concerning is that I could not find any information about this organisation anywhere on the internet. What's especially concerning is that the UNDP report describes the establishment of a global headquarters, country offices, regional offices, and policy centres for the digital ID rollout. It even reveals the roles that the public and private institutions will play in this digital ID dystopia. The paragraph that really stuck out to me was, quote, country offices will be the primary drivers of digital program design and implementation in the field. They will be supported by networked digital advocates with specialized training, as well as ICT associates who will support the rollout of new corporate systems and processes. I couldn't help but be reminded of how WEF chairman Klaus Schwab is ushering in the Great Reset using a massive network of so-called young global leaders and so-called young global shapers. Maybe these young leaders and young shapers will also be digital advocates for the UN's Digital ID initiative. You can learn how to survive the Great Reset using the link in the description. Anyways, before I tell you about the possible outcomes of the UN's digital ID rollout, I want to give you an overview of the digital ID rollouts in some of the largest countries and regions. I'll exclude China because we already know what's happening there, and I don't want to spoil the ending, so to speak. So, let's start with the United States. As some of you will know, many US states tested de facto digital IDs during the pandemic. However, it wasn't until a few months ago that US politicians tabled the, quote, Improving Digital Identity Act, which lays the legal framework for a national digital ID. What's disappointing is that the Improving Digital Identity Act was co-sponsored by pro-crypto Senator Cynthia Lummis. I suppose her definition of cryptocurrency is different from ours. For what it's worth, a few details in the bill seem to set limits on how involved the federal government can get in digital ID. The Digital Identity Act specifies that the US government will need to create a website listing all digital ID services within 450 days of the Act becoming law. Assuming that the bill is passed sometime next year, this means a national digital ID could be rolled out in the United States by 2025, on schedule with the UNDP. What's interesting is that the United States seems to be the only country where a CBDC will be rolled out before a digital ID system. This assumes that the Federal Reserve's FedNow fast payment system will be analogous to a CBDC, which has been mentioned by the BIS. FedNow will be released in mid-2023. Meanwhile, in Europe, the European Commission has been working on a block-wide digital ID system since 2014. However, it wasn't until the pandemic that European politicians amped up their digital ID efforts. Digital ID regulations were first proposed last year, and I should note that they come with a built-in digital wallet. When the digital ID regulations were proposed last July, EC Commissioner Thierry Breton said, quote, The European digital identity wallets offer a new possibility for them to store and use data for all sorts of services, from checking in at the airport to renting a car. Basically, folks, it will be used for everything. Now, this is terrifying because Thierry is the same EC Commissioner who's been pushing for internet censorship in the European Union via the Digital Services Act. If his name sounds familiar, that's because he's the guy who's been publicly threatening to ban Twitter in the EU. Pure totalitarian. In any case, the European Digital ID wallet will become available in EU countries sometime in 2024, once the remaining red tape is cut, again on schedule with the UNDP. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank's digital euro is expected to be rolled out in 2025 or 2026 after regulations are passed next year. I'll quickly note that this all assumes that Circle's USDC and EuroC stablecoins won't become de facto CBDCs for the US and the EU. This synthetic CBDC setup has been promoted by the WEF, but a privately issued CBDC seems to be a point of contention for the public organizations in the UN's digital plans. More about Circle in the description. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you what the good old United Kingdom has been up to on the digital ID front. Like the US, the UK introduced digital ID legislation earlier this year. It's not clear when this legislation will become law, but contracts between the UK government and contractors run to 2024. This will be a fairly tight timeline, since the UK is expected to introduce a digital pound, dubbed Britcoin, in 2024. It's quite possible that the UK will be leveraging Circle to do this. This is because the UK government granted the first virtual currency license to Circle in 2016, and Circle announced plans for a pound stablecoin in April this year. Now, if you're interested in keeping up with digital ID developments, I strongly recommend checking out a website called Biometric Update. It was an invaluable resource during my research for this video, and the writing is surprisingly neutral given the content matter. I honestly suggest checking it every day, as I now do. And now for the fun part. Will the UN succeed in its global digital ID rollout? Well, that insane UNDP report actually outlined 4 possible scenarios. The authors were careful to state that the UNDP is not claiming any of these scenarios will happen. I reckon people are asking enough questions as it is. So, the first scenario is called, quote, on the same trajectory. The TLDR is that if things keep going the way they are, then big tech will take over, disinformation and misinformation will dominate, and the climate crisis will spin out of control. Quite the combination of outcomes. The second scenario is called, quote, falling into the abyss. Funnily enough, this scenario seems to be the one where crypto adoption becomes rampant. That's because in this scenario, the elites take things too far in their quest for power, which causes communities to self-organize, deglobalize, and live freely. What's hilarious is that this scenario includes, quote, the population growth is explosive. It leads to the depletion of natural resources. The rate of pollution is unprecedented. The world does not seem to be a sustainable place to live. Now, I for one don't understand how deglobalization could possibly lead to this outcome, nor the AI takeover they envision. I suppose it reveals the ideology of the people in power at the UN. It also reveals that they aren't aware of the fact that human populations have peaked in most countries, or will be peaking soon, as per the UN's own population modelling. More about that in the description. Now, the third scenario is called, quote, radical new normal, which certainly doesn't help with the premeditation speculation. This scenario can be summed up as one where the private organisations of the UN take over and, ironically, force people to live in the same community-based way as in scenario 2. Not surprisingly, the fourth scenario is called, quote, in pursuit of sustainability, and it outlines an outcome where the public organisations of the UN take over. It's one that can only be described as environmental communism enforced by AI. A key theme is that citizens trust their governments a lot. On that note, in the introduction to the future scenarios forecasted by the UNDP, the authors reveal the real motive for the UN's Digital ID initiative and all the other dystopian top-down systems that are required for the UN's SDGs to be met. Quote, digital changes in information ecosystems have led to the near collapse of public interest in many contexts, rampant information pollution, declining trust in governance institutions, and serious challenges to both democratic political processes and evidence-driven public policy. Indeed, recent polls have revealed that trust in the mainstream media, the government, and international organisations is at an all-time low and continues to fall. Now, call me crazy, but it might have something to do with the fact that the institutions aren't all that trustworthy and explicitly seek control. Put simply, they did it to themselves and have nobody but themselves to blame. Now, to wrap things up, I want to give you my take on what the outcome of the UN's Digital ID initiative will be. Believe it or not, but I think it will fail because of all the assumptions that underlie the supposed benefits of rolling out digital ID systems. As I mentioned earlier, the statistics in the Digital ID study by McKinsey & Company have been cited in many studies and blog posts about digital ID. As you'll hopefully recall, the consulting firm admitted that the voluntary adoption of digital IDs is only around 10% in most countries. Here's the kicker. The most cited statistic from McKinsey's report is that it will increase the GDP of countries that roll out digital ID systems by up to 13%. However, this assumes an adoption and usage rate of over 70%, usage being the key word. People can be forced to adopt digital ID, but not to use it. Not only that, but the 13% increase in GDP only applies to certain developing countries that don't have robust ID systems. For developed countries that do have robust ID systems already, the increase in GDP is projected to be a measly 3%. Again, that's assuming more than 70% adoption and usage rate. If BlackRock's due diligence on FTX is anything to go by, the private interests at the UN probably haven't done their research about how much they will actually make when digital IDs will be rolled out. If the compliance with pandemic passports is anything to go by, they'll be lucky if they don't lose money. Once the private interests find out that they're losing money or not making as much as they were led to believe, they will probably pull out or lessen their investment. This will cause the UN's SDGs to fail the same way the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, failed. But let's assume, for the sake of entertainment, that the private interests stay on board. This begs the question of how the UN will force the average person to adopt an actual digital ID after their respective governments finish rolling them out in 2025. By now, you'll know that the only way is to create a crisis which requires the use of digital ID, which therefore begs the question of what's coming. My bets are on the upcoming energy crisis, the upcoming food crisis, and the upcoming financial crisis. This is because some countries, such as Iran, have already started using digital ID to allocate food rations. It will not surprise me at all if we start to see the same in other countries for both food and energy. Now, I must stress that this is all speculation, and I'll reiterate that there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that any of these crises were premeditated. Let me repeat. Absolutely no evidence, and don't you go looking for any. Contrary to what the conspiracy theorists claim, the truth will not set you free. In all seriousness, it's more than likely that the adoption of digital ID will be driven by some form of emergency stimulus. It's more than likely that this stimulus will come in the form of a CBDC, because the central banks need to test them on a smaller scale the same way the governments did with their digital IDs. If I had my tinfoil hat, I'd tell you that the actual financial crisis can't be allowed to happen until the central banks have tested their CBDCs. That's because a financial crisis would be the ideal way to force the average person to adopt CBDCs, and it would be very unwise to do this when a CBDC is brand new. If my tinfoil hat is receiving the correct signals, so to speak, a financial crisis won't come until the second half of the decade, when most central banks feel comfortable with their CBDCs. This doesn't mean we couldn't see some economic crash between now and then, but I reckon there's room for one more multi-year zero-interest rate rally. Fortunately, there is a silver lining to my tinfoil hat. That's that by the time the central banks have finished rolling out their CBDCs, cryptocurrency will have likely developed to a point that it's become a viable alternative to the current system. This will provide a way out for the people who want freedom. The availability of this alternative will inevitably result in a split in the system, which could run both within and between borders. One system would be controlled from the top down by the elites at the UN, and the other system would be controlled from the bottom up by the average person. What happens after that is anyone's guess, but the UN's SDG-driven digital ID push has made one thing abundantly clear. The people in power are desperately trying not to lose control. As cliched as it sounds, that's really what this is all about.